The Nikos show. Today I'm joined by Pyotr Kurzin. He is a established podcaster. He runs the Global Gambit podcast on YouTube and also has a large community on Twitter following him and some of his events there. He is a well-studied person, eclectic background, studied for around 9 years in sort of geopolitical items, and his podcast interviews people with quite a different, diverse background. So very happy to have you on the show today, sir.
Thank you, sir. It's a delight to be on, and I appreciate that overly generous introduction.
So today's topic we want to talk about is what would the world be like if we had just allowed Russia to take over at least half of Ukraine, taking Kiev and those parts, probably 3 or 4 times the amount of refugees. I'm just wanting to know your thoughts on what you think the world would be like right now.
Yeah, that's when you reached out to me with that topic title, I was overjoyed as a geopolitical strategist and nerd to want to play war scenarioing, but equally it's a difficult one to think about because there's a lot of unknowns. So I want to premise anything I say by saying that this is largely conjecture. But it's based on some historical facts and so on. I think it's worth thinking about it in the short, medium, long term, but also what the initial objectives of this SMO or military operation / invasion were. So there's a very good piece by the Imperial War Museum in the UK which talks about what the real war was intended to be, which was largely a 3 to 7 day invasion. The initial invasions of February 24th, we saw what the Russians intended, which was the use of paratroopers, blitzkrieg style invasion across 3 prongs, the north, the east and the south of Ukraine, to try and just completely overwhelm the Ukrainians on all different fronts and force the capitulation and eventual resignation of the incumbent government, Zelensky's government. Now, we could tell, I think, internationally speaking, when that point passed, because, again, referring to this rather useful resource from the War Museum, was that basically the Russians hadn't sent in a large proportion of their actual formidable forces. They had sent in a sort of skeleton entity to basically hold the areas of like outposts, strategical points, infrastructure, that sort of thing, and then wait for the actual main military to come in. But what they weren't encountering was that the Ukrainians, obviously in the 8 years since Crimea occurred in 2014, had become a lot more formidable, a lot more prepared for this, and so within the first week it went from being, oh my god, Russia's invaded, they're going to steamroll Ukraine, to, well, the Ukrainians are holding out quite well. Could we see this turning into a longer term conflict? Most people didn't think as long as now, but we thought maybe, this isn't going to be what we assumed. And that's why the peace talks were actually developing, or people thought that they would go somewhere, even if, there wasn't a genuine intent by the Russians to pursue them. All the Ukrainians, some people say that both sides weren't genuinely interested in it, but then how could you be as Ukrainian since your country's now just suddenly got a bunch of Russian troops in it? But yeah, largely speaking, the goal was to force the resignation of Zelensky, because by definition, if you remove the government, you control the country. Now, that's obviously in theory what's supposed to happen. There's a difference between physically controlling all of Ukraine from the western part in bordering Poland, Romania, Moldova, and the east, versus, controlling 2/3 of it or a half of it, as you said, and removing the government. To actually physically control every section of Ukraine in its land mass would be a big stretch for the Russians, because they have a lot of other theatres that they need resources and troops for, and Ukraine is a big country. It's the biggest country in Europe if you don't count Russia. So that was a significant, so when people say, oh, well, no, they didn't want to control all the country. No, they probably didn't want to control physically all the territory, but they wanted to control Ukraine. And then from there, well, then that's when you go into the short, medium, long-term time frames. Short term, you would have seen a exodus of migrants that dwarfs what we've seen now. I think it's about 6.5, 8 million have crossed the borders in different times. A lot of people
sounds right.
Back.
Yeah.
So it's hard to keep an idea of the exact numbers. And you would have seen longer term, we could dive into this a bit more, but longer term you would have seen, an unprecedented, dangerous, new set of principles set, that the events of the Second World War are still, valid in the sense of encroachment, the removal and subjugation of people, a complete breach of the UN Charter, which Russia and every country in the world is largely a signatory to. And I personally think that if Russia had and did get its way, it wanted to turn Ukraine into more like Belarus, a Belarus 2.0. Because what does that give Putin? It gives him a huge land buffer between what he perceives to be the greatest threat, which is NATO. But what else does it do? It gives him unprecedented control of the Black Sea, freeing up pieces to pressure the Baltics. But it also means he has undisputed monopoly over food and energy in many areas because of how much Ukraine provides in grain, wheat, but also energy in the form of Zaporizhia nuclear and the energy reserves that are suggested to be in parts of the Black Sea south of Ukraine. So it's this strategical, ideological, and economic / materialistic reasons that were behind this, and that would have greatly benefited Russia had it succeeded.
You can imagine like Lithuania and other Baltic states, Estonia, looking at this half of Ukraine basically been taken over, whatever, and if we hadn't supplied all the weapons to sort of hold back the Russian offensive, it's debatable whether Ukraine could have held them back as long as they have without the weapons support. So those countries would be economically wrecked just by looking at that, because you have a lot of brain drain, people leaving because they don't want to end up in the same situation as Ukraine. If NATO and those countries are so handicapped not to supply of weapons to Ukraine, then there's almost like you just can't trust Article 5 of NATO.
Yeah, I mean, the first country that would be most at risk or under pressure and really feeling the heat is Moldova, because of the Transnistrian, this strip of land on the northeastern part of the country. I think it has about 300,000 ethnic Russians, or Russians that have expressed a strong desire to be sort of incorporated into Russia somehow. They held a referendum in the 90s. All of this is largely nonsense, but the Moldovians aren't part of NATO, and like Georgia, they are of interest to the Russians. So in my mind, and some other people's, again clarifying that I'm not a military analyst, but I've studied this region from a sort of regional perspective, not so much from a thematic perspective, was this idea of Novorossiya. So there's a very good image if people just type in New Russia. Basically, it was the concept in the late 1800s under the Russian Empire, which was that Russia controls eastern and south Ukraine. And why? Because then that goes, and why does Putin want to retake this bit particularly? Partially because of the ethnic Russian thing, partially because of the relationship to the south, so to Crimea and the Black Sea, but also because then it links up nicely with Transnistria and Moldova. So you've got this sort of like, if this is Ukraine, you've got this large slip, which is Moldova over here, and then sort of this part eastern Ukraine. So I'm doing it towards the audience. And it cuts off Ukraine for many maritime access. So this was sort of what I was thinking if Putin had succeeded in, maybe not his initial objective one of taking all of Ukraine, so he tries and takes this substantial part of Ukraine, and that's what he's been still trying to do with Kherson and pushing westwards. And that's why when we saw, I think in February, March, this claim by Russian propagandists that Ukraine was planning an attack in Moldova, it was obviously the Russians trying to stem up support in Moldova for sort of some kind of it never went anywhere, but there was this stuff, I think, in February, if I remember correctly. So that's what I thought was largely. But then if you talk about the Baltics, the Baltics are the three main countries that are, significantly at risk. Because why? They're small, they have huge, at least proportionate to their overall populations, ethnic Russian presence. I think if it's Estonia or Latvia, I forget which one, 25% of the population is Russian, or has a strong Russian association, including with the language. And this is a country that's, 2-3 million. So, what's that? 500,000 people identify significantly with the Russian background. So that gives Putin a legitimization, if he wins what he wants in Ukraine, a legitimization to go in and do the same with the Baltics, at least in theory. But the big point of all of this is NATO. So this then comes to a quandary. If the Russians had succeeded in that way, does that mean that NATO has to sort of, capitulate, agree with the Russians in that they give up territory to bits of territory? You've got Kaliningrad, which is obviously an important area, but does that mean that the Russians then give that use that? Sorry, does that mean that the Russians use that as a way to legitimize demanding more? Hey, this territory of Latvia's got a lot of ethnic Russians, you should give us that, or we're gonna make your life even harder. Obviously the West, and I think a lot of other countries, wouldn't just sit by and be fine with that. They would probably try to sanction and prevent it, but it would certainly have emboldened Russia to an extent that we haven't seen had they won.
Sorry, I got disconnected there.
For viewers, that Novorus aspiration of the imperialist empire of Russia, which Putin has said, he wants to rekindle Russia's greatness in the world, and so he looks to the Soviet Union / Imperial Russia as a sort of model of that. And Novorossiya is basically the section of Ukraine, largely the eastern oblasts and Kherson, that he wanted to control. As I said, I think it was scenario 2. Scenario 1 didn't work, which was the whole forcing of resignation of the Ukrainian regime. Then this is the second one, because at least he controls all of the Black Sea, or access to the maritime access, and it links up nicely with Moldova, which is another breakaway. And it all plays into this narrative of protecting ethnic Russians, bringing all ethnic Russians into motherland Russia, be them in Transnistria, eastern parts of Ukraine, whatever. And then I shifted over to the Baltic states, since that's what you were talking about. They would be one of the main next sites. Georgia would also watch, and Azerbaijan and Armenia, again, because they're not protected under NATO. But the Baltics, why? Because, one, you have Kaliningrad. Kaliningrad is a very interesting but also complicated, landmass that is hugely important for Russia's maritime operations in the Baltic Sea and the northern part of Europe, and generally gives them a foothold further into Europe. But also, what does it do? It acts as a, launching pad to push this sort of narrative that the Russians have interests in that sub-region, i.e. the Baltics. And if you look at the demographics of Latvia, Estonia particularly, these are countries that have, 1 to 2 million people, and about 25-30%, I think in the case of Latvia, is, ethnic Russian, or strong associations with Russia historically. So what does that mean? That means that this plays into Putin's narrative of needing, again, to protect ethnic Russians. So if he succeeded in his initial ventures in Ukraine, what would have this done for the Russians in these countries? Now, this is different because there is the element of NATO, and it's absolutely without question that NATO wouldn't just bend over backwards and give Putin what he wanted, but it does, as I say, set a dangerous precedent, which is that Russia is much more legitimized. It's much more, at least perceived to be more powerful, even if their military still wasn't as competent as we might think. And so, what if Putin starts pressuring parts of the Baltics? Not all of them necessarily, but just bits. And he goes, well, this bit's got, more Russians live there than Latvians. We therefore feel that we need to defend those Russians because of the NATO, presence in the country. Some narrative along those lines. So then sort of, does that lead to a standoff between the NATO alliance and Russia? Or do we see some scenario where the NATO alliance are like, well, maybe we should just allow Russia to sort of take this little bit of the Baltics for the sake of, greater good or protection of the whole of Europe? That's a really tough one to call, because the alternative would mean direct engagement with NATO and Russia. But when it comes to the potential of capitulation or appeasement, sometimes that plays out. So the Baltics would have definitely been on the radar, and that's not a scenario I ever really like to think about too much, because that is the closest we would have got really to significant kinetic warfare / tactical nukes, nuclear threats, highly securitized, even more than we're seeing now, and along a much broader border with the Europeans, because Russia now controls Ukraine and is right on the borders with a lot more members. So, yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
That's great insights. I think that. Have you seen the movie Threads?
It sounds familiar. I may have. Remind me.
It was basically an accurate prediction of what nuclear war with Russia would be like in the UK, from the point of view of people living in Sheffield, and it occurs when Russia invades some kind of part of Iran, and then things escalate to use of NATO using B-52 bombers on Russian positions, and then Russia responds with a tactical nuke on the I think on the American B-52 base, and then they attack with a tactical nuke on some Russian base, and then the hostilities stop, and then American carrier gets sunk, and then it escalates into basically full nuclear warfare. And but if I think if a Baltic state was attacked by Russia, I think NATO would use conventional means without thinking too much about it. I mean, I'm pretty sure they're all ready to go. But I think there would be some extra safeguards in place before tactical nukes were employed on a Baltic invasion scenario. You'd hope, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I forget the doctrine official names for the NATO. I think if I remember it rightly, they call it the action plan or something, generic like that. But it was basically they had. There are other areas of the NATO mandate which allow the NATO alliance to be activated, to be readied, mobilized. But this is one of the points that I remember reading in another scenario, which is that if Russia were to conduct some kind of, invasion or whatever, occupation campaign against the Baltics, that's a much bigger pronged campaign, and this is an area that is already highly, highly militarized. You've got battle groups down there which are led by the British, the Germans, if I remember correctly, and now Finland is part of NATO. So are we talking about a scenario where NATO didn't have Finland as a member, or it now did? Let's assume that we do, have Finland as a member. That makes the whole front way harder for the Russians. And the Finns are some of the most battle-hardened, given the in Winter War of 1940 and the continuation war of 44, taking on the Soviet Union. Eventually, yes, they had to sort of agree to an armistice with the Soviets in the late 40s. But, the fact that they did do this and push the Soviets back shows you that the Finns are not anyone to be messed with. And I remember reading one poll which puts them at the most willing to defend their country. I think it was over 74% of the Finns, both women and men, mind you, would be willing to take up arms to defend their home. So all these play into whether or not the Russians would have an easy time in kinetic warfare, but that's the point. If you then have a case where Putin is finally being really battered because he's going up against frigging NATO, that leads to him likely thinking, shit, either I have to accept that we're going to be fools, or I really ramp up the use of the nuclear rhetoric in a way that makes the threats that he has made in the past year look like a sort of, a genuine joke, like a sort of, just playing around with you. So, yeah, it's kinetic warfare would initially be the case, but then you'd also need time to reinforce the lines of NATO, American troops and other larger country forces to come to this area. And then what's to say that Putin wouldn't open another front in Moldova, pressuring Romania and Bulgaria, because those countries are not exactly the most relative to say the Poles effective militaries. So would he try and open a two-pronged front to distract and divide NATO's resources? And then how long does that last before we then do start hearing the threat of nukes or other non-conventional forms of military warfare, which are either illegal or just no one wants to imagine. So yeah, that's why I think a lot of people feel that they can't even really entertain this, and why the West hasn't just sort of allowed Russia to do that. We saw what happened in 1938, 1939 with the Czechoslovakia and the appeasement of the French and Chamberlain.
I think what this Russian invasion has shown is that if you have nuclear weapons, you can attack any country you want that's not part of a bloc, and any military blocs like NATO or whatever won't step in to provide a no-fly zone. That's what Ukraine was begging for. And we as the West shown that we will basically allow anybody to do anything in terms of if they have nuclear weapons. It's just a very dangerous precedent that we've shown. There's basically cowards we are.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when the fly zone was really being pushed in Ukraine in the first 2 months of the war, and this was the thing. It was at the rate that NATO wasn't going to get involved directly, mainly because it doesn't have to, because Ukraine's not a member. But again, people are like, what's the right thing to do? A no-fly zone was the next thing, and a no-fly zone was a tricky one because it is very much on the boundary of, it is an intervention. If you get NATO planes enforcing this no-fly zone, the Russians suddenly shoot one down or vice versa, well then that is that legitimizes again, or that gives the authorization to do these things, for the Russians to take it to the next level, the NATO to reply or whatever. I don't think it maybe would have led to that. I think they both would have tried to sort of talk it down or sort of find another way around, like more economic warfare, sanctions and so on. But it still was a dangerous precedent, and this is what this whole war is about. It sets dangerous precedents, and that leads me to the other thing, which I think we should keep in mind, which is every other country that was observing this. We are focusing on the two main elements of this, which is Russia and the West, or / Ukraine and the West, US, whatever, NATO. But what about every other country that has aspirations for reclaiming territory that it believes it's historically right to own? Or other countries that rely on Russia?
China, India, North Korea.
Yeah, it emboldens countries like Iran, it emboldens China, Taiwan. That's the most obvious example. If Russia succeeded in the way that it had done, I guarantee the Chinese wouldn't be acting like they were now. The Chinese watched with surprise, I think, like many other countries did, at the sheer unity and resolution, or resolve rather, that the West did have. Yes, we can question whether or not that's going to last outrightly, but the West did have, and has had for large parts, in supporting Ukraine. That has made a lot of countries realise, the West is not, just going to sit down and sort of be pushed around. And so the Chinese would have had a very different calculus when it comes to their operations with Taiwan. So this is what would have happened if Russia had gotten its original plan or been able to keep large parts of Ukraine. It would have meant any other country that owns other parts of another country or has, existing feuds with another country, they feel much more willing to do that. Think Kashmir, even as a pretty extreme arbitrary example. Both India and Pakistan suddenly feel that, hang on, the Russians have done it. Well, maybe that means we can do it. And so they start to, put up the pressure, turn up the heat on the opposing side to give more of the land back to the other. And then what do we have? Two of the most, antagonistic states to one another, both nuclear capable, intensifying their own activities in the region. So again, this is all very speculative, but it's that sort of domino effect that can happen.
So how long do you think Russia can hold up, given that it has its allies in the BRICS? I don't know why the BRICS want to be associated with Russia, but anyway, Putin's making deals with some, I think, 20 or so African leaders, China. Yeah, what kind of timeline do you think before Russia just completely collapses economically?
Yeah,
status quo?
So there's a couple of points I'd say to that. One, I don't think Russia's going to completely collapse economically. It's too important to the international system, including the Europeans. I mean, whether we like it or not, the Europeans still do acquire some energy from Russia, and the last thing they want, I think. Well, I mean, maybe they don't care. But from an international energy standpoint, the collapse of Russia would be bad for provision of energy. If you suddenly got a bunch of rogue actors, be them Wagner Group and other sort of, nationalistic forces vying for power in a fragmented former Russian Federation, what the hell does that mean for borders with China, with Kazakhstan, with the Central Asian states, with Europe? Russia is also a signatory to a lot of resolutions of the UN, which, again, whether we like it or not, is important for other areas of international security. So Syria, North Korea, parts of Africa like Libya, Yemen, even I think Haiti, the Russians have had some kind of activity. I can't remember exactly, but the point is Russia is a Security Council permanent member, has a veto, has the largest stockpile of nuclear weapons. As it stands, I don't think the endorsement of the collapse of Russia is wise. Could we see in another hypothetical scenario breakaway provinces like Chechnya or I forget the other one, Dagestan, is it? Those ones, the more ethnic diverse parts of Russia sort of breaking away if Russia really wasn't able to hold on to them? Yeah, possibly, but the entire fragmentation and collapse of Russia, not a scenario I think is the best one. Change of government, sure, more constructive interactions internationally, sure, but yeah, let's say that happens. I think there's a lot of scenarios there, a lot of unknowns that would develop. And as for the BRICS and Africa, so we've actually done a lot of conversations on my channel on the podcast about this, if people are interested. The Russia-Africa summit this year was a lot different to 4 years ago. 17 member states came instead of 43, and Putin signed a bilateral deal with 6, mainly all the countries that Russia already has strong standing military presence and interests with. So Mali, Burkina Faso, Chad, and a couple of others which I can't remember. And in some ways, the Russia summit is, Russia's efforts to respond to the Chinese and the Americans when they do this. The Americans held their own Africa summit in December of 2022. So, Russia is doing this partially because it needs to, but also partially because it's about optics as much as it is about material return and gain. And Russia wants to be seen still as the third major player on the international stage of the sort of the big boys superpower club. And it doesn't have the same capacity. Yes, it's an energy superpower, unlike the other two, so unprecedentedly unrivaled, but it doesn't have the same GDP, and it does have a lot of now pressures from the sanctions and attempted isolation by the West or other countries, right? So Russia is seeking to garner interest and friendships and opportunities with other countries. Now, and as one of my other guests, Cameron Hudson of CSIS said, the Africans are about opportunism. They are about non-alignment. They want to be able to have the opportunity to choose. So if they want to do business with the Russians, they want to do business with the Russians, and they don't think the West or the Chinese or whoever it is should tell them otherwise. And so, Russia is seeking to play on this by really pushing the narrative of Western colonialism. But what Russia is doing in Ukraine is seen by some countries in Africa, not all of them. A lot of Africa has abstained from UN votes or voted in support of condemning Russia, but they've not then followed through with sanctions. Kenya is probably the most vocal country that has, associated what Russia is doing with history of colonialism in the West as neocolonialism. So a lot of African nations are aware of this, but as we speak, they're holding the BRICS, and that's the other thing. The BRICS is not a security alliance. It is a club of 5 states that was identified by the Goldman Sachs economist in the early 2000s that would have the largest propensity to challenge the biggest. The dominance of the West and be a huge source of energy, economic growth and population and so on, right? But there is a lot of limitations with the BRICS. I'm not downplaying that the West is waning, that the US dollar has issues. The weaponization of dollar has definitely alienated and pissed off a lot of countries. But the BRICS are not, free of issues. The Russians and the Chinese are there largely for strategical convenience. The Indians, the Chinese can't stand one another, and I don't see that being resolved anytime soon. And the Russians and the Indians have constructive relations, but again, that's largely based on economic, opportunity as much as it is, ideological alignment. The one thing that the West does have, or NATO or whatever, does have, is that there is a strong belief in liberal democracy, rule of law, ideological values that the Russians and the Chinese, for example, don't have. The biggest thing that unifies them is their distaste and desire to, you remove the US as the dominant hegemon. So the BRICS has potential, but they need to figure out what it is they want to do. They need to figure out an action plan, like actually create a membership path, because there's no actual way to join the BRICS at the moment. It's just sort of, 40 states have expressed an interest. Okay, now how are you going to go about joining the BRICS? How are you going to about actually creating a mandate for the BRICS beyond just a new development bank? They've tried to create an IMF equivalent, and they've struggled to do that. So, and the other problem with all of this is China. China is by far the largest country in there, right? 20 trillion GDP versus India and Russia, which are about 2, 3. So there's a lot of elements of the BRICS that we need to keep in mind, in the sense of it's when, over what timescale it could grow, and to what extent. If they do create some alternative currency, which one is it? And why not then just use gold, as another guest of mine on the show said just last week. So, all of these things. And then as for your question about Prigozhin and Putin, Prigozhin is, I don't know an intricate amount of his past, as I focus on the macro grand scale of things. The biggest person I've spent time, reading into as an individual is Putin. The mutiny in late June was the single biggest threat that Putin has faced in his time as leader. Now, there are people on one side who say that this is the end of Putin. He was, it's absolutely, he's finished. I don't get that far. And then there are other people on the other side who, I got into Twitter storms about, who were like, this was all planned. It was all, crafted, involving Prigozhin, Putin, Lukashenko, the leader of Belarus. I think that's ridiculous. I think it was genuinely a feint, i.e. it was, a facade by Prigozhin to force Putin to say stuff or respond, like in the sense of he was going to go up to Moscow, and the further he got, so it was feint. He was feinting, going to actually try and topple the government, it was never really about that. If you watched his actual statements, his problem was with the defense structure. So Shoigu and Gerezhimov, the chief of staff, I think it is, right? Or the head of the military staff. And he wanted those two people gone. Now, I'm not saying I agree with Prigozhin on much, but I do think Shoigu's an idiot, and Gerezhimov has not exactly done a good job of proving his military expertise on the field in Ukraine. So Prigozhin, as someone who was fighting with a supposedly competent force of, fighters in the Wagner Group, is pissed off. But does he have the capacity to lead Russia? No. He was a chef, and then he built one of the most successful PMCs, or private military contractors, in the world, and, you know, has been able to leverage that with the backing of the Russian government. Like, we shouldn't deny that the Russian government has been giving lots of money to Wagner to conduct their operations in Africa and elsewhere. You know, he's not a statesman. Putin is still a politician as much as he is a military strategist. He isn't a military strategist. So I mean, you know, to be honest, we're not just at the bottom of the barrel. We've punched through the barrel and are scraping and, you know, trying to get all the bits of the beer off the pavement, if you understand my analogy, which is Putin and Prigozhin are so bad. Like, you know, we're not exactly picking between sort of, I don't know, you know, Biden, who's not exactly great, but at least he's not trying to cause an insurrection in the American, you know, versus Trump, who did, and that sort of thing. You know what I mean? So, so Putin is one thing, but at least he's a known entity. Largely speaking, we know he'll make these false threats with nukes, but then not necessarily follow through. Prigozhin is a completely unknown actor. We don't know what he would do, and would he just give, you know, tactical nukes to parts of the Wagner group to just sort of use in the field? You know, really have no idea. So, you know, Putin is the preferred entity to stay, just because we know him. Largely speaking, we've dealt with him for 20 years. Does that make him the preferred overall? No. You know, people like Navalny, the guy who's been in prison now for 20 years, and then other people like Medvedev, the former president, and a couple of other people. These are all people that names have been floated, but frankly, you know, there isn't a singular person in the Russian political system that really is a great option. And that's not me endorsing Putin. I want to make that emphatically clear. I think the guy is the worst on the planet. So it's just about strategical. It's just about, you know, what then? You know, you remove Putin, but then what happens? You know, you can't just remove Putin and have. Mm-hmm. So I'm not being immoral here. I'm just being rational. In thinking further down the line, what comes after.
You've got an excellent summary, and I really value your thoughts and insights. Really clear, really helps. You've got quite for a young guy, you've got quite a broad understanding. So it's really fresh, really insightful what you're saying. Just as we come to a close here, I just wondered if you could share any other insights that you want to share, and perhaps give a little bit of a prediction how you things will play out in the next 2 or 3, 4, 5 years.
Well, had you asked me this in the winter, I would have said I think it largely depends how the counteroffensive goes for the Ukrainians. Again, I'm not a military analyst. I haven't served, but I read a lot about geopolitical issues, and I think decent at drawing parallels and identifying similarities or differences between these things. And now that we're coming to the end of the summer, setting into the autumn, you know, the Ukrainians have a closing window to make any sizable gains on the front. Now, Eastern Ukraine is the most mined area in the world, and some analysts put, you know, it would take over 20 years. Let's just say nothing exists in Eastern Ukraine as in wartime. It would take over 20 years to demine the entire country, because of how much the Russians have put down as defensive lines to stop any Ukrainian counteroffensive. Then there's the trenches, then there's the dragon teeth, these big, you know, things that stop tanks from rolling around, and so on. So basically, the Ukrainians are trying to get through a pretty tough set of defensive lines. And they have a closing window to do that before the terrain, the conditions of the weather, and so on, temperature, don't support that. So, does this mean that the West continues to support Ukraine outright and we push for 2024 counteroffensive? That's a tough one. I do think that there is going to be a growing consensus, and this is not just me saying this is reflected in polls in the US. At the start of the war, you know, 2/3 of Americans, including most Republicans who tend to be less pro-supporting Ukraine and priority America obviously first, were supporting Ukraine. That is now shifted, and the majority of Americans, in a poll that was done by CNN a couple of weeks ago, stated that, now a majority, it's a slim majority, and it also depends on the polling and the kind of question. You have to take in all these factors, support changing how much is given to Ukraine. Financial, and there's also different types of support. So all of these caveats need to be kept in mind when we talk about how much unconditional support is given to Ukraine. The idea of the Abraham tanks, for example, yes, they've been promised, but there was also only 180 of them, I believe, that was promised, and it would take over a year for the first Abrams to actually land ready to go in Ukraine. Over a year. So February, March 2024. That's not really sort of that useful, and then really pro-Ukrainian voices are saying, we've got to speed up, we've got to give the Ukrainians even more, everything. Stop holding back F-16s, give them everything. And dovish people are like, well, hang on, guys, there's also a black market here, or hang on, guys, is that really going to change the overall direction of the war? So then we begin to talk about, war of attrition, long-term war, grinding on, largely not much territory being exchanged, sort of World War One scenario, right, where for much of 1917, 16 or something, the land goes this much and then this much, and we're not talking miles, we're talking centimeters, meters, right? The whole war around Bakhmut over the winter was literally around Bakhmut, which most people agreed, including the Russians, held no strategical significance whatsoever, but it became a moral and symbolic essence of the war. Both sides were so determined to keep it, and in the end, the net actual territorial gain for Ukraine, or whoever it was that controlled it more, was sort of literally you can sort of pick it up. It reminds me of the Blackadder scene where they have the bit of terrain in the office, and they go, "So, General Melchett, how much land did we keep?" "Oh, this, sir." "Oh, great. How big is this?" "Oh, no, it's to scale, sir." "Ah, I see. Well, fantastic. Oh, there's a worm there. So the point is, it literally, it's like this big. We're talking. I mean, I'm being slightly facetious, but that the Blackadder sketch illustrates that what we're dealing with here. So war of attrition. So this war just grinds on. The Russians being, put into a wartime setting. The Ukrainians being supported on a much lower scale. Again, this is all hypothetical, by the West, and so we just have this line of contact. Now, instead of the line of contact being in the Donbass, in parts of Donetsk and Luhansk, it's the entirety of those two provinces or oblasts, and a bit of Kherson and Zaporizhia. So basically, a large section of Ukraine has now become the fighting area, and it basically just becomes lost to time. The world moves on. The world adjusts. The world not embraces, that's the wrong word, but sort of we learn to live with it. The international community, the international system learns to live with this much larger line of contact, offensive conflict between the Russians and the Ukrainians. And eventually maybe the Russians, just through sheer strategical patience, as it's known in their doctrine, force the Ukrainians because they just have more numbers. The Russians know how to deal with pain. They lived in a siege in Leningrad for 785 days. Russians can endure hardship. And so this is why a lot of Russians don't think the West understand, that the Russians will not give in to what they perceive as Western dominance. And so what does that mean? So we just see this frozen conflict? It doesn't ever change? Or are there other scenarios? And these last two ones I'll come to a draw with, which is that, one, a DMZ kind of styled North Korea, South Korea, but east to west. Do we see a armistice in the form of a Korean War armistice when neither side admits defeat and they just sign a ceasefire and that's it? That's it. We are forever in a state of war, but there is not much happening. Maybe the occasional artillery fire, and maybe sometimes there's a flare-up, like say in other parts of the world where a bomb drops or someone's conducting exercises as a show of force, and then they accidentally drop a bomb, and then the other side respond, and we get like what happens between Palestine and Israel. Border clashes with missiles going across for sort of 5-10 days. Could that happen? Quite possibly. It should also emphasize that the Ukrainian economy in this scenario is, it's already completely lost. So, Ukraine, a lot of eastern Ukraine is completely uninhabitable. Europe has to deal with a much larger influx of refugees. And do we incorporate Western Ukraine into NATO? Do we incorporate Moldova? Do we fast track them? What happens then? And then the other scenario is one of, which is more far-fetched, a Cyprus scenario, namely whereby the UN comes in with peacekeepers. Obviously, this has to be done at the agreement of the Russians with their veto, which is highly unlikely, but let's say the Russians go along with it, because it allows them to then not have to worry about the front line, and they can restock and resupply and remilitarize or re-strengthen their economy, and we get a buffer zone, like in Cyprus. After the Turkish invasion of 74, the UN came in and created this buffer zone between northern Cyprus and Cyprus. And basically the UN enforces a buffer zone between eastern Ukraine, or Russia's oblast that it controls, and western Ukraine. And then the peacekeepers are there, and then we just learn to live with that. And does that last? Does one side decide, screw it, we're going to go over? But again, that's a very far-fetched scenario and one that's not likely to happen. But these are the sorts of things that could happen in 5 to 10 years. And obviously the world's going to be a different place. Does China invade Taiwan? Does Russia try and support them in that? What happens with Russia's interests in the Middle East? Does Russia have to reorientate its economy significantly? Lots of unknown questions. But I'll leave it there, and thank you for the conversation.
Thanks very much, Pyotr. It was really good to have you on, and we'll definitely do this again, and let's hope that Russia goes back to Russia and stays there instead of just having this constant drag on all of our lives, and especially the lives of people in Ukraine. So thanks very much for your time.
Thanks a lot, Nikos. It's been great, and hopefully we can talk about something slightly more specific next time, so I'm not going off on loads of tangents, and can have a deeper dive. But yeah, it's a great conversation.